Sunday, 25th of May, 2025. Heathrow was at full tilt. Passport queues drifted forward, luggage belts hummed, and the arrivals hall kept its steady rhythm. Families reuniting, business travelers scanning for cars, tourists shepherding overstuffed suitcases across polished floors. In that tide of movement, a young woman stepped out from a long-haul flight. She was 23, calm, composed, and indistinguishable from 100 other passengers who landed that hour. What set her apart wasn't her demeanor, it was what she was carrying. A single heavy cheese wheel, labeled Parmesan, nestled among her belongings. To most eyes, it was a quirky souvenir, a conversation piece for a dinner table. To trained eyes, it was a question mark. Border Force officers asked about the cheese. The story was simple. A friend had suggested she pick it up in Lima, Peru, for them to try. Routine questions followed. Then came the checks, the quiet, methodical kind that turned curiosities into evidence. Inside the wheel, beneath the rind and the expectation of something ordinary, was something else entirely. Crack cocaine, later measured at 94% purity, an illicit cargo valued at roughly 800,000 pounds. This is the story of Jamie Choi, an American student turned drug courier whose journey traced a winding arc across South America and ended under bright airport lights in London with a guilty plea in Isleworth Crown Court and a prison sentence measured in years, not months. Jamie Choi's journey began thousands of miles away from the UK. A student from California, she had recently dropped out of the University of California, Santa Barbara. In her bag, officers at Heathrow later found a small notebook. On one page, dated 21st May 2025, she had written, "I dropped out of UCSB on Monday. Currently, I'm in Paraguay in South America, solo traveling for the first time. It's been amazing so far." That short entry provided investigators with a snapshot of where she had been and what she was doing in the days before her arrest. It also helped map out a route that took her across 3 countries in less than a week. On the 20th of May, she flew from Los Angeles to Lima. The following day, she traveled to Asunción, Paraguay. On 24th May, she boarded another flight via São Paulo in Brazil, eventually landing in London the next morning. To the outside world, it might have looked like the itinerary of a young traveler on a gap year, moving across South America in search of experiences. But when Border Force officers at Heathrow cut into the hard rind of her Parmesan wheel, the reality was exposed. Hidden inside was high-purity crack cocaine, tightly packed and destined for Britain's streets. At 94% purity, the drugs had hardly been cut. Experts later said the consignment could have been broken down into thousands of smaller deals, feeding local supply chains and worth an estimated 800,000 pounds on the street. The method, hollowing out a cheese wheel to smuggle narcotics, was both simple and calculated. Food items from fruit to coffee to meat products have long been used by organized crime groups as cover for drug trafficking. Cheese, with its density and strong smell, can mask other substances from both the human eye and detection equipment. Once the find was confirmed, Jamie Choi was arrested on the spot. Border Force immediately referred the case to the National Crime Agency, who specialize in tackling international drug smuggling. The cheese wheel, the drugs, and her notebook became exhibits. Forensic testing confirmed the purity of the cocaine, while her travel history showed the unusual pattern of flights across Latin America just before she arrived in the UK. By the time she appeared at Isleworth Crown Court on the 6th of August, 2025, the evidence was overwhelming. Faced with the findings from Heathrow and the forensic results, she pleaded guilty to importing Class A drugs. A week later, on the 12th of August, she was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months in prison. For the National Crime Agency, the case was another example of the lengths smugglers go to in trying to move drugs across borders. They described the seizure as a significant interception that had prevented a large consignment of crack cocaine from reaching organized crime groups in Britain. For Border Force officers, it was a reminder that vigilance and persistence, checking even the most unlikely items, can stop major quantities of drugs from slipping through. And for Jamie Choi, it marked the end of a journey that had begun with solo travel in South America and ended in a UK prison cell. Jamie Choi's arrest was more than just a bizarre discovery at Heathrow. It was the culmination of a carefully mapped journey and a reminder of how drug cartels adapt their methods to exploit ordinary travel. The Parmesan wheel was not chosen at random. With its dense texture and strong smell, it offered natural concealment. To anyone glancing quickly into her luggage, it looked like a harmless, if unusual, souvenir. But once officers decided to probe further, the disguise fell apart. Inside was nearly £1 million worth of crack cocaine, one of the purest consignments intercepted at a UK airport that year. Investigators pieced together her movements. From Los Angeles to Lima, then Paraguay, then Sao Paulo, and finally London, her route mirrored pathways, already known to law enforcement as transit points in the international cocaine trade. South America remains the world's largest producer of the drug, and traffickers often use complex flight patterns to disguise its origin before moving it into Europe. Choi's notebook added a personal dimension to the case. Her words suggested the mindset of a young woman on an adventure, traveling alone for the first time, documenting the excitement of leaving university behind. But alongside that narrative sat the reality. She had carried a wheel of cheese filled with high-purity cocaine into one of the busiest airports in the world. When she appeared before Isleworth Crown Court, the facts were undeniable. The drugs were real, the concealment deliberate, and the potential harm enormous. On the 6th of August 2025, she admitted importing Class A drugs. Days later, she was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months in prison. The judge made clear that anyone who tries to smuggle such dangerous substances into the country must expect a significant custodial sentence. For Border Force and the National Crime Agency, the case became a warning. Organized crime groups will use food, household goods, and any item they believe can pass as ordinary to hide their cargo. For them, every intercepted parcel, suitcase, or in this case, cheese wheel, is a battle won in a constant struggle against international trafficking networks. For Jamie Choi, it was the opposite. What began as a flight across continents ended in a prison sentence that will define her early adulthood. The Parmesan wheel that she carried through Heathrow was more than an unusual item of luggage. It was the piece of evidence that brought her journey to an abrupt end and ensured she would spend years behind bars in the UK. The case drew immediate attention not just because of the amount of cocaine seized, but because of the method. A cheese wheel, something associated with family meals, markets in Italy, or gourmet kitchens, was turned into a vessel for one of the world's most destructive drugs. The contrast made headlines across the UK and abroad. The National Crime Agency highlighted the seizure as an example of the ingenuity and risk traffickers are willing to take. They warned that the £800,000 worth of cocaine inside that single wheel could have fueled violent crime and addiction if it had reached the streets. Border Force officers were praised for spotting something suspicious in what looked like a simple food item. Their intervention meant that an entire shipment was stopped at the border before it could vanish into the networks of organized crime. Court documents and reports made clear that Choi was not some seasoned smuggler with a long criminal history. She was a young woman, barely out of university, who had left California and crossed South America before landing in London. Yet whether out of naivety, desperation, or pressure, she carried with her drugs of the highest purity. At 94%, the cocaine had hardly been cut or diluted. Dealers would have broken it down into thousands of smaller deals, multiplying its street value and extending its impact. In court, she offered no elaborate defense. She pleaded guilty, accepting the charge of importing Class A drugs. That decision may have shortened her sentence, but it could not erase the seriousness of the offense. On the 12th of August 2025, the judge sentenced her to 5 years and 3 months in prison. For someone of her age, it was a punishment that meant losing much of her 20s behind bars in a foreign country, far from her home in California. The case also showed how international the drug trade has become. Her route from Los Angeles to Lima, through Paraguay, on to Brazil, and then to the UK, mirrored the global paths cartels use to move product. Each stop was a potential handover point, each airport another link in the chain. By the time she stepped off the plane at Heathrow, The cheese wheel she carried was not just luggage. It was evidence of how far and wide the trade in cocaine now stretches. For the authorities, the message was clear: vigilance at the border works. Even the most creative methods, whether it is drugs hidden in fruit, meat, coffee, or cheese, can be exposed with persistence and training. For Jamie Choi, the message was harsher. Her attempt to smuggle drugs into the UK ended not with the adventure she had written about in her notebook, but with a conviction that will follow her for the rest of her life. After her sentencing, law enforcement officials spoke openly about the wider meaning of the case. For the National Crime Agency, Jamie Choi's attempt was another example of how organized crime groups look for people they can exploit. Young, inexperienced, and traveling alone, she matched the profile of someone who might be persuaded or pressured into carrying illicit goods. Whether she was fully aware of what she was doing or not, the reality was the same. She was caught with drugs worth nearly £1 million, and she alone would bear the legal consequences. Border Force also underlined the significance of the interception. Heathrow is one of the busiest airports in the world, with tens of millions of passengers passing through every year. The scale of movement makes it a constant target for traffickers. But every seizure, they said, is proof that careful checks can make a difference. A single cheese wheel had the potential to unleash widespread harm if it had reached the streets. Stopping it at the gate prevented untold damage. The case resonated beyond the courtroom because of the details revealed. The notebook found in her bag painted a picture of a young woman who had just left university life behind, who described her South American trip as amazing so far. It was a jarring contrast. Personal notes about adventure sitting next to evidence of high-purity cocaine. That juxtaposition turned the story from a simple border bust into something more complex, raising questions about how someone so young ended up at the center of such a serious crime. When the judge handed down the sentence of 5 years and 3 months, he sent a clear signal. The UK courts treat drug importation with the utmost seriousness, regardless of age or personal circumstances. The purity of the drugs, the method of concealment, and the potential street value all weighed heavily in determining her fate. For Jamie Choi, the outcome meant years in a British prison, thousands of miles from home, family, and friends. The moment she had stepped off the plane at Heathrow, she likely imagined nothing more than getting through customs and beginning the next part of her trip. Instead, that walk through the arrivals hall became the turning point that defined her early adult life. The Parmesan cheese wheel that looked like a souvenir will now be remembered as the object that exposed the crime, and her story has become a warning. No matter how inventive the smuggling method, no matter how ordinary the disguise, the risks are enormous, and the consequences are life-changing. The aftermath of the case rippled through both local and international media. Headlines about a young American caught with drugs in a Parmesan wheel captured public imagination because it seemed almost surreal. Cheese, something familiar and harmless, had been turned into a vehicle for one of the most addictive and destructive drugs on the planet. Reporters covering the story emphasized the value of the drugs seized. At around £800,000, it was not a minor bust, but a significant interception that would have supplied countless street-level deals. Authorities pointed out that consignments like this are the lifeblood of organized crime, fueling violence, exploitation, and addiction across the UK. Stopping one wheel of cheese might sound trivial, but stopping the drugs inside meant disrupting part of a much bigger network. For Border Force officers, the case became an example they would point to when explaining why routine checks matter. Most passengers carry nothing more than clothes and souvenirs, but hidden among them are those few who, whether by choice or coercion, carry something far more dangerous. The skill lies in spotting the details that don't quite fit. The odd item, the shaky story, the unexpected travel route. Jamie Choi's travel route in particular stood out. Los Angeles, Lima, Asunción, Sao Paulo, and finally London. It was not the itinerary of a typical tourist, but it mirrored established trafficking corridors from South America into Europe. To investigators, it showed how cartels attempt to disguise the origin of their product, bouncing couriers through multiple countries before their final destination. In the end, her guilty plea at Isleworth Crown Court removed any doubt. She admitted importing Class A drugs and accepted her punishment. The judge, sentencing her to 5 years and 3 months in prison, underscored the seriousness of smuggling drugs of such purity and value. For Jamie Choi, the adventure she described in her notebook ended abruptly. Instead of memories of solo travel, she was left with a conviction and years in custody. For the authorities, the case was another reminder of how vigilance, persistence, and experience at the border can stop organized crime at the very first hurdle, entry into the country. And for the public, it was a story that showed how the global drug trade hides in plain sight, sometimes even inside something as ordinary as a wheel of cheese. Jamie Choi's case sits within a long line of inventive concealment methods that traffickers have used to try to slip drugs past authorities. In past years, Border Force officers have uncovered cocaine hidden inside fruit, coffee, even meat products. Smugglers rely on everyday items to mask odor and distract attention, betting that customs staff will not look too closely. A wheel of Parmesan cheese fit that pattern perfectly. Ordinary enough to seem harmless, bulky enough to hide several kilos, and fragrant enough to confuse detection. But in this case, the strategy failed. The cheese was opened, the contents tested, and the cocaine revealed. Its purity shocked investigators. At 94%, it had barely been cut or diluted. Experts estimated that once broken down into smaller amounts for street sale, it could have fueled thousands of individual deals. That was the reality behind the £800,000 figure repeatedly cited in reports. Not just money, but the sheer scale of harm the drugs could have caused if they had reached the streets. When Choi stood in court, her age and her background could not outweigh the facts. She was 23, a university dropout who had been traveling across South America. Her notebook suggested excitement and freedom, but the evidence in her luggage told another story. By pleading guilty, she avoided a longer trial, yet the sentence, 5 years and 3 months, was still severe. The National Crime Agency stressed the importance of the seizure. Preventing such a large consignment from entering the UK meant disrupting supply lines to organized crime groups. Border Force officials, too, reminded the public that their vigilance protects communities from the violence and exploitation that drugs bring. For observers, the case was a mix of the ordinary and the extraordinary. A young traveler, a handwritten notebook about new adventures, and a single food item hiding almost £1 million worth of cocaine. It showed that the global drug trade can intersect with everyday life in the most unexpected ways. And it left behind a stark lesson. Behind every unusual item checked at the border may lie consequences that stretch far beyond the luggage belt. Her story closes on a note that is both cautionary and tragic. What began as a young woman's journey across South America, described in her own handwriting as amazing so far, ended in a UK prison cell. The Parmesan cheese wheel she carried was no harmless souvenir. It was the piece of evidence that turned her trip into a criminal case. For Jamie Choi, the outcome is years of her life spent far from home, serving a sentence in a foreign country. For Border Force and the National Crime Agency, it is proof of their vigilance, a reminder that even the most ordinary-looking object can conceal extraordinary risks. For the wider public, it is a window into the creativity and desperation of organized crime networks that will go to any length to move their product across borders. The drugs seized at Heathrow that day, 94% pure, worth around £800,000, never reached the streets. They never entered the chain of dealers, buyers, and victims. They were stopped at the very first point of entry, and that single act of interception disrupted part of a much larger network. Jamie Choi's name will now sit in the record of UK drug prosecutions, not as a kingpin or an organizer, but as a cautionary example of how quickly a journey can turn and how one decision can change the course of a life forever.